Thank you for joining us for another installment in the McConnell Center series, Why You Should Read. My name is Dylan Tipton, and I'm a McConnell Scholar at the University of Louisville. If you haven't already, please take a moment to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and any other platform that you're listening to this on. Doing so helps you stay up to date with our programming and helps others find our work as well. Tonight, we had the distinct privilege of welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Polet, who will guide us through Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions and explain why this work remains essential reading. Dr. Polet is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Hope College and currently serves as the Director of the Ford Leadership Forum at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Russell Center for Cultural Renewal. His current project is a book that reinterprets the Federalist in light of anti-Federalist arguments against ratifying the Constitution. Please join me in welcoming back Dr. Polet to the McConnell Center.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you all. It's a pleasure for me to be back here again and to be speaking to a live group of people. It's always nice. I've been asked to speak about this work here, Rousseau's Confessions, and I assume that some of you have read parts of Augustine's Confessions already. Is that correct? Am I right about that? Okay. I want to suggest, by way of introduction, that Rousseau's Confessions and Augustine's Confessions are important counterweights or countermeasures to each other. Augustine's Confessions in many ways encapsulate the ethos of the medieval world. Augustine was a bishop who lived in a world where everyone lived under the cope of heaven, right? All the hearts were ultimately directed toward God. And if you remember from reading Augustine's Confessions, the Confessions are written as a prayer. They're not written as a kind of self-reflection or a self-meditation, but they are written as a prayer to God. They're in part a meditation upon the nature of God, but more than that, they're a meditation on the relationship between God and man, and the realization that we can't come to know ourselves unless we come to know ourselves as God sees us. In other words, we only come to know who we truly are in relationship to our Creator. And that's really the kind of framework of Augustine's Confessions. Rousseau's Confessions are part of a completely different world. So what if you have the same sets of problems that Augustine addresses in his Confessions, right? I mean, there's a reason why Rousseau calls them the Confessions, and in a lot of ways he models this book on Augustine. But Rousseau is doing something a little different. How do we come to know ourselves in a world where we can't really know God? How do we come to know ourselves if there's either not a God who knows us or we can't know ourselves as God knows us? Even more of a problem, how do we come to know ourselves where our knowledge of ourselves is constructed by the way other people perceive us? Obviously, Augustine is kind of writing at the beginning of the Christian centuries. Rousseau is writing at their conclusion, when Christianity is no longer the formative cultural force. And in the wake of that, and in the kind of tumult of that, he's trying to come to some sort of clarity about who we are and how we come to know ourselves. So he's born in 1712, which is right toward the end of the reign of Louis XIV. I'll try not to wander around too much. I tend to do that, but I'll try not to. right toward the end, both metaphorically and figuratively, I guess, right toward the end of the reign of Louis XIV, and he dies in 1778 during the American Revolution, but at the period where French society is in tumult, and within a decade we will have the French Revolution. Rousseau is in many ways the great architect of the French Revolution. If you read Simon Schama's book Citizen, which is for my money the best book written on the French Revolution, he does identify Rousseau as the great architect of the French Revolution. During the Revolution, the revolutionaries find his remains and they transfer them to the Pantheon in Paris, where you can still find his tomb to this day. He is a revolutionary thinker, and I will confess, I have an enormous soft spot for Rousseau. There's really very few thinkers I enjoy reading more than I enjoy reading Rousseau. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that right at the conclusion of my lecture. He's born in 1712 in the city of Geneva. The city of Geneva is the city where John Calvin established a theocracy, and Rousseau is very much influenced by that. If you want to understand Rousseau's political thought, you need to know something about Calvin's political thought. And there is this kind of underlying Calvinism that goes throughout Rousseau's thinking throughout his life. His parents, his father is a watchmaker. His mother is part of the noble class. She dies 9 days after he is born, and until the age of 10, he is raised by his father. One of the things about the relationship between his mother and father is that, if you recall from the passage that you read, is that his father married above his station. And that's a theme that comes out a lot of ways in Rousseau's writing, this idea that people are assigned stations. And these stations are dispositive, they're stationary in a certain way, that once you are born to a certain place, you're kind of stuck in that place. And that becomes, again, a kind of theme for Rousseau throughout his career. So he hears this from his father, that Rousseau's mother was above his station. He doesn't know his mother, but his father maybe mythologizes her, in any case venerates her. And Rousseau grows up with this idea of his mother as this remarkable human being. And maybe there's a tinge of guilt about this because she dies as a result of childbirth with him. And one of the things that we see in Rousseau is a very complex psychology. He and his father read together a lot. And among the things they read are the lives of Plutarch. And he becomes kind of enamored with this idea of great figures who are noted for their virtue. And he begins to identify with these figures. And that too, as we will see, becomes an important theme in Rousseau. His father dies when he's 10. Apparently he remarries at some point. We don't know exactly when, but it is his first wife whose name is on his lips as he passes, which probably wasn't really cool for the second wife, but true love knows no limits, I suppose. From that point forward, he's kind of a vagabond. He spends a couple of years with his mother's family. They try to raise him. He wanders around a lot, and at a young age, he leaves Geneva and makes his way to France. And over the course of his life, he spends a good deal of his life in France. He spends part of it in Italy. While in France, he spends part of it in the countryside and part of it in Paris. And he also spends some time in England. That's in England where he writes his confessions. As you can see, my copy has gotten a lot of use over the years. He tries any number of professions over the course of his life. He spent some time as a watchmaker. He spent some time as an engraver. He spent some time, he spent some time as a person who does musical notation. He spends time as a writer. He spends time as a civil servant in the office of an ambassador to Venice. Composer, musicologist, writer, novelist, playwright. He's kind of a guy who tries his hands at a lot of different things. He says at one point that he wishes that he had just been able to stick into that position he had as an engraver. And he said, if I could have done that, I would have probably had a comfortable bourgeois life, and I would have had a reasonable vocation that would have kept me occupied, and I probably would have been happy. Like, I wouldn't have had too much money, I wouldn't have had too little money. It would have been stable, it would have been comfortable, I probably would have been okay, but then I made the mistake of leaving the engraving business. And he says a phrase that gets repeated throughout the Confessions, and that was kind of the source of all my misfortunes. You'll discover there are a lot of sources to his misfortunes, and a lot of misfortunes. He flips around on religion quite a bit. Right? He's born in Calvin's Geneva. His father has to flee Geneva, actually, at one point, because, as I understand it, he wore a sword of a nobleman, and he wasn't a nobleman himself. And so he was indicating that he was actually above his station, and he was going to be imprisoned for this, and he had to flee the city in order to avoid imprisonment. And again, right, think about, it's very foreign to our kind of way of thinking about these things, but these class structures, right, these social hierarchies are so set in stone. And so whatever, you're Rousseau, you're 8 or 9 years old, and your dad has to flee the city because he's wearing a sword that he wasn't supposed to wear. What kind of imprint does that make upon a young man's or a young boy's consciousness? I will mention her again in a little bit, Madame de Warrens, who is the secondary figure in this work. If Rousseau's obviously the primary figure, she is the secondary figure in this work. He meets her when he's around 18 years old, and she becomes this enormously influential figure in his life. But one of the things that she does is she identifies young Protestants, kind of uncertain, unstable young Protestants, and she makes Catholics out of them. And so she kind of convinces Rousseau to become a Catholic. He moves to Italy, he becomes a Catholic, and then at some point he goes back to France, goes back to Paris. Things go badly in Paris, as they usually do for him. He tries to make his way back to Geneva again, and he can't get into Geneva because he's a Catholic, so he decides once again to reconvert back to Calvinism so he can re-enter the city of Geneva. He says at one point, it's one of my favorite passages in the Confessions, where he's talking about the Calvinist problem of predestination. So if you don't know much about this, there is a strain of Calvinism that teaches what is known as double predestination, and that is from before the world was made, God had saved some people and condemned others. And you don't really know whether you're among the saved or the condemned. So Rousseau was struggling with this problem, And he decided the way to resolve this was to throw a rock at a tree. Now, I know you've only read a little bit of the Confessions, but I think you've read enough to know that he probably wasn't the most athletic person in the world. So if he's trying to throw a rock at a tree, I mean, he's not like Dr. Greg, who played baseball back in the day. The odds aren't real good. So what he did, as he describes it, he says, I decided if I miss the tree, that means I'm damned. If I hit the tree, that means I'm saved. So I made sure I found a really, really big tree, and I stood as closely to it as I possibly could. And I threw the rock at it, it hit the tree, and from that point forward, I was absolutely convinced of my salvation. I never had to worry about it again. If it only were that easy. There's a final theme I want to draw your attention to that is a really prominent theme in the Confessions, and that is his relationship with women. There is not a section of the Confessions where he is not falling in love with someone. And I'm not a psychologist. I don't pretend to be one, but I think it's fairly clear that some of his relationships with women are related to his non-relationship to his mother and his relationship to his father. There are some stories from when he was a young boy. I won't go into the details about them, but they seem to have, at a very young age, sort of constructed and, in the eyes of some at least, perverted his sexual desires. And so he always had kind of atypical or non-conventional sexual desires. But he was always, like, every time he would meet a woman, he would fall in love with her. It was almost inevitable. There's one story in the Confessions where there's an Italian opera company that has come to town. He's listening to the women sing, and he's just absolutely smitten by their voices. And he's like, oh my goodness, like I'm in love, like just listening to them sing. And then after the opera's over, he meets the director, and he brings the women out. And as Rousseau describes them, they're hideous. They're nothing to look at. But then he's trying to remember their voices. So he's kind of like blanking out the way they look and trying to remember the way they sang, and then saying, well, the way they sang tells me what I know about their souls. So he falls in love with them anyway. As I said, you can't go 5 pages in the Confessions without him falling in love with another woman or another set of women. What are we to make of all this? Right? If we take these kind of 6, right? His background, his wanderings, his inability to hold down a career, his flipping on religion, his tempestuous relationship with women, his equally tempestuous relationship with friends, which is how the Confessions really ends, is the fact that all his friends have turned against him. And of course, that's not his fault, that's his friend's fault. But there was a story there involving a woman, or actually a couple of women, that lead to the breakdown of his relationship with his friends. What are we to make of all this? Well, I want to suggest that there are a couple of things worth paying attention to, and one of the reasons why this book remains relevant and remains so important. How do we stabilize our sense of self in a very unstable world? In a socially stable world, you can maintain a clear sense of self by simply playing the roles that you are expected to play. In a socially stable world, I could say to myself, well, I'm married, but I am, by the way, I'm married and I have children. Right? I'm married. Am I playing that role well? I have 3 children. Am I playing the role of father well? I have relationships with friends. Am I playing those roles well? I have a vocation. Right? I am called to do something and to do really that one thing. Am I performing that role well? And my sense of self evolves out of how well I'm playing those roles. And I don't have to spend too much time thinking about it. Like in some ways, you know you're playing those roles well based upon the feedback you're getting from other people. But in an unstable world, in an unstable social world, how do we stabilize our identities, our sense of self? And so Rousseau is one of the first thinkers to realize that what I'll refer to as modern man, and that is people born roughly from the 16th century forward, are in a state of permanent identity crisis. We're never quite sure who we are or what is expected of us. Indeed, whereas for ancient man, you could say that identity is stabilized by your position in the hierarchy of things, and the hierarchy is good, right? It creates systems of obligation. It creates our sense of purpose. It creates our sense of identity. And if you read the Iliad, right, part of the great tragedy of the Iliad is that Agamemnon has not recognized Achilles' proper role in the hierarchy of things. And that's what drives the drama in a lot of ways. Rousseau does something quite radical, and that is he suggests that social life is inherently unstable, that even for the ancients, there was a kind of gloss on identity and a kind of gloss on social life, but it's an inherently unstable enterprise because as soon as we find ourselves in some sort of interaction with our fellow human beings, we are always going to engage in comparison with one another. So now we're not only not sure what we think about ourselves, we're not sure what other people think about us, and we're not sure what we think they think about us, and we're not sure what we think about them. What we do know is that we end up comparing ourselves. Like we try to get our sense of self from comparing ourselves to other people all the time. How smart am I? I don't know. Like so-and-so's smarter than I am. How attractive am I? I don't know. So-and-so's probably more attractive than I am. How talented am I at that? I don't know. So-and-so's probably more talented at that than I am. So all of social life, Rousseau says, becomes consumed by comparison of ourselves with one another. And a lot of times in that comparison, we are found wanting. There's almost always going to be someone better at any one thing than we are. And additionally, what we do is when we're engaged in comparison with one another, we create social forms around the sort of rankings that emerge. And so Rousseau says what happens is comparison leads to status designations. And whatever else is true of us as human beings, once we enter into social life, we become consumed with status. Where are we in the hierarchy of things? Where do we rank? And we have this kind of status anxiety that drives so much of what we do. We want to elevate our status, and we're afraid of slipping down on the status hierarchy. And as a result, we are perpetually anxious. Perpetually anxious. How do I get ahead? How do I keep myself from backsliding? And if you think about it, you can find examples of this in our lives all the time, right? Money is a status marker. Not only educational achievement, but educational pedigrees are status markers. Right? Letters we can put behind our names are status markers. So one of the reasons why the self is so unstable in the modern world is because our status is always tenuous. In a way, it really wasn't, Rousseau believed, to ancient men, except that he thinks it's not simply a movement from the ancient world to the modern world. He thinks as soon as we move from our natural state as solitary individuals into social life, we are automatically entering a pathological situation that's going to drive us crazy. The second reason why the self is unstable is because we are internally divided. We are divided between our passions, our feelings, and our reason. Well, Plato argues something like that. This is nothing new. What's new in Rousseau is his complete conviction that reason might lead us astray, but our feelings will never lead us astray. There's a theme he returns to repeatedly throughout the Confessions, that wherever he has been uncertain about something, his feelings have always been a reliable guide. He says at a number of points in the Confessions, I might not remember the details of that event that well, but I remember what I felt. And what I felt is the guide to truth. Not an accurate representation of events, but what I felt is what is true. A third division that Rousseau draws our attention to is between imagination and reality. I'm going to return to this in a few minutes, but this is really an enormously consequential distinction. There is the world as it is, and there is the world as we imagine it to be. And the world as we imagine it to be, we can either try to achieve through some kind of revolutionary action, or we can try to achieve by a kind of escapism. When reality becomes too hard to bear, we escape into a world. And one of the things that we see in Rousseau is a kind of toggling back and forth between, there's some of this revolutionary idea, but there's also very much in Rousseau, especially in the Confessions, this kind of escapist idea. Right? When reality becomes too much for us to bear, what we need is to return, in some sense, to the solitude that marked the wholeness, the completeness, and the bliss of our original solitary situation. There's a final thing I want to draw your attention to in Rousseau that makes him such an important figure for us. And here again, I think the comparison with Augustine is really important. If you recall the beginning of Augustine's Confessions, my heart found no rest until it found its rest in you. Right? Restless desire. And one of the stories of Augustine's Confession is how this restless desire keeps attaching itself to different things. Right? As a young man, it attaches itself to sex. At a certain point, it attaches itself to wealth. At another point, it attaches itself to status. At another point, it attaches itself to Neoplatonism. At another point, it attaches itself to Manichaeism. Right? Whatever this restless desire is, it's trying to find something that will satisfy that desire. And Augustine's realization is there is only one thing that can satisfy our desire, and that is something that is eternal and unchanging, and fullness in itself. I mean, the most powerful passage, for my money, in the Confessions is when, in Book 4, he describes the death of his friend. Right? And he's overwhelmed with grief. And in retrospect, he looks back on that and he says, you know, we had this incredible relationship. And in some ways, it was satisfying my desires. But you know what happens to friends? They die. Right? Everything in this world is kind of ephemeral. It's vanishing. So the only thing that's going to be able to satisfy our desires is something that's not ephemeral. That is not subject to the whims of time and chance. That's very much true in Rousseau, to a degree. He keeps talking about the nature of his desire. And in some ways also, Rousseau attaches that desire to transient things. But one of his great revelations, one of his great epiphanies, is that his desire has no object. And this is something he repeats throughout the Confession. There are no objects for my desire. So what I have is just raw, unquenchable desire. And it's going to direct itself wherever it will at any given time. Right? But it is a thirst that can never be quenched. And this is part of what I think Rousseau recognizes as a tragedy in his own life, right? That his desire has no object. It's one of the reasons why he's constantly falling in love with women all the time. When he finally marries Therese, you know, he goes, yeah, she was fine. Like, we got along well, we had nice conversations. Hard to discuss this book without getting into some detail, you know, but he says, you know, the sex was perfunctory. You know, there was nothing special. You know, it was friction at best. You know, but, you know, we got along well and she seemed okay, but, you know, it was these other women who were the objects of this kind of deep, you know, Sophie and Marie and Madame de Rennes and others, who were the objects of desire. And more often than not, he was not able to have them. And that just inflamed his desire even more. So, this is part of the thing, right? What do we do with the fact that we are creatures who desire, but often our desire has no object to it? And so we construct objects, we imagine objects for it. All right. I want to draw your attention to the beginning of the Confessions. Wow, this goes fast. It's really an incredibly distinctive beginning. I have resolved on an enterprise which has no precedent and which, once complete, will have no imitator. My purpose is to display to my kind a portrait in every way true to nature, to what we really are. And the man I shall portray will be myself, simply myself. I know my own heart and understand my fellow man, but I am made unlike anyone I have ever met. I will even venture to say that I am like no one in the whole world. I may be no better, but at least I am different. Whether nature did well or ill in breaking the mold in which she formed me is a question which can only be resolved after the reading of my book. Let the last trump sound when it will, I shall come forward with this work in my hand to present myself before my sovereign judge and proclaim aloud, here is what I have done. And if by chance I have used some immaterial embellishment, it has only been to fill a void due to a defect of memory. I may have taken for fact what was no more than probability, but I have never put down as true what I knew to be false. I have displayed myself as I was, as vile and despicable when my behavior was such, as good, generous, and noble when I was so. I have bared my secret soul as thou thyself hast seen it. Eternal being, so let the numberless legion of my fellow men gather around me and hear my confessions. This is a different audience than what Augustine has for his confessions, is it not? Let them groan at my depravities and blush for my misdeeds, but let each one of them reveal his heart at the foot of thy throne with equal sincerity, and may any man who dares say, I was a better man than he. Part of what Rousseau is doing in this book, I think, is holding up as a mirror to all of us. And saying, in this flattened world without transcendence, this is who we all are. And maybe I'm a more intensified version because I have stripped away a lot of the bourgeois comforts and the bourgeois virtues that make life less interesting, less dramatic. But in the end, this is kind of how we're all wired. This is how we're all made. Compare this with what he says at the beginning of the second part of the Confessions. I think I asked you to read this, page 262. He's talking about, right, he's let the project go for a number of years. He's picking it back up again. And he says, today my enfeebled brain and memory make me almost incapable of work, and I'm only undertaking this task under compulsion, with a heart oppressed by grief. The first part is kind of his youth, and then the second part, I guess what we call old age. Since he's quite a bit younger than I am when he's written this, I'm not going to call it old age, because that would be embarrassing to me. But it was the 1700s after all. It can offer me nothing but misfortunes, treasons, perfidies, and sad, heart-rending recollections. And I would give everything in the world if I could enshroud what I have to say in the darkness of time. Being forced to speak in spite of myself, I am also obliged to conceal myself, to be cunning, to try to deceive, and to abase myself to conduct that is not in my nature. The ceiling under which I live has eyes. The walls that enclose me have ears. Uneasy and distracted, surrounded by spies and by vigilant and malevolent watchers, I hurriedly put on paper a few disjointed sentences that I hardly have time to reread, let alone to correct. I know that despite the huge barriers which are ceaselessly erected all around me, they are always afraid that the truth will escape through some crack. How am I to set about piercing these barriers? I am attempting to do so, but with little hope of success. Judge whether this is the stuff out of which pretty pictures can be made. And again, right at the beginning of the book is, I am painting a portrait. And now he's saying, yeah, it's not a very pretty one. Or such as can color them with attractive colors. In other words, to gussy them up, to make them to appear other than what they are. So what's happened? Part of what's happened is, I suppose, a kind of disillusionment. But what Rousseau is doing, I think, is he's associating youth with innocence, with a kind of purity, even though he's thieving all the time, as a young kid. He still kind of proclaims his innocence even when he's caught, except in one instance. I'll talk about that shortly. And with a kind of bucolic existence. It's carefree. It's natural. And so he thinks that this sort of mimics the species, right? Phylogeny recapitulating ontogeny. His individual existence is kind of recapitulating the existence of the species. Pure, innocent, selfless, natural, and then it moves into civil life and it becomes corrupted. And it becomes miserable and unfortunate. I said I wanted to mention the story about the ribbon and about the one theft. It's, I think, really the most interesting passage in all the Confessions. I'm sure I had you read it. Story about the ribbon, where he is working as a footman in a household. He's doing this as a relatively young man. He's probably 12 or 13 at the time. And this is how he's spending his life. He's working as a servant in the household of local nobility. And it kind of rubs him the wrong way because he thinks that he's quite gifted and intelligent. And it seems to him arbitrary at best, unjust at worst, for him to be at other people's beck and call. And he doesn't really go into the reasons why he does it, but he's in this house and he still steals this red and silver ribbon. And he leaves it in a place apparently where it's easily found. And they find it and they accuse him and he says, "Oh, it was not me, it was Marie. She's the one who stole it and she gave it to me." And he's reflecting back on this in his later years, as we all can, right? Like think about, I'm not going to ask you to do it publicly, but do it privately. Like think about stuff that you've done in your past that you regret. Like, I can't believe I did that. What was I thinking? That's not the kind of person I want to be. Not the kind of person I think I am. And so he steals this ribbon, he pins it on this poor girl. And again, it's 18th century France. So who knows what becomes of her? He doesn't know what becomes of her, but he knows it's not going to end up well for her. And she gently protests her innocence, and the more gently she protests her innocence, the more vociferously he proclaims her guilt, until the people who run the household take his side and dismiss her to a life of who knows what kind of abject misery. And at the end of that passage, I should immediately have thrown myself at it. My age should be taken into account. I was scarcely more than a child. Indeed, I still was one. In youth, real crimes are even more reprehensible than in riper years. But what is no more than weakness is much less blameworthy, and really my crime amounted to no more than weakness. I suppose that's one way to think of it. So the memory tortures me less on account of the crime itself than because of its possible evil consequences. What happened to this girl? But I have derived some benefit from the terrible impression left with me by the sole offense I have committed. For it has secured me for the rest of my life against any act that might prove criminal in its results. I think also that my loathing of untruth derives to a large extent from my having told that one wicked lie. If this is a crime that can be expiated, as I venture to believe, it must have been atoned for by all the misfortunes that have crowded the end of my life, by 40 years of honest and upright behavior under difficult circumstances. Now, that's a harsh form of judgment in its own right. It's like the French writer Camus once said, he has no need for judgment in the afterlife because he's seen judgment in this life, which is far harsher. Poor Marion finds so many avengers in this world that however great my offense against her may have been, I have little fear of carrying the sin on my conscience at death. That is all I have to say on the subject. May I never have to speak of it again. For Rousseau, this is indicative of the absolute corruption of social life. Rousseau's fundamental belief is that we are by nature good and are corrupted by our social institutions. And part of his evidence for that claim is this story of what happened in that household, where he sold out a poor young girl for a crime that he had committed. I know I'm a good person. What would cause someone like me to do something like that? Unless our social institutions were so corrupted that I became corrupted in the process. And we get it. It's part of trying to fit in. I think we all try to fit in some ways. We do care what other people think about us. And often we hate ourselves for caring so much about what other people think of us. And Rousseau identifies that kind of self-loathing also. That it's bad enough that we're playing a game that we are not the architects of, that we didn't make the rules for. But that game makes us kind of hate ourselves. The most important example of this in Rousseau's life, I know I'm running out of time here, we'll move on, is on page 328, where he talks about the contest for the Academy in Dijon. They have a contest for an essay on whether progress in the arts and sciences has led to moral progress among human beings. He sees the announcement for the contest. He thinks to himself, oh, that's interesting, and he's encouraged by friends like Diderot to write an essay. He writes an essay which argues the opposite, that in fact, progress in the arts and sciences have corrupted morals. And he wins the contest. So for the first time in his life, he now has the kind of esteem that he has wished for. And in the Confessions, he identifies that as the source of all his misfortunes. Because now he's kind of ascended the social ladder. He's no happier for it. Expectations change, pressures change. In his second discourse, where he's kind of talking about this, he reflects back elliptically on the first discourse, and he compares himself to King Midas, who, having received what he wished for, discovers it is now the source of all his misery. And so what does he do? There are, as I said, a couple of strategies he employs. One is escape. And there are different ways you can escape, but the most important way to escape is, well, one way is just to go out into the country and be a hermit and get away from everyone. And he talks about that as a viable way of doing things. But he also does something else. This is page 398, although ignoring the human race, I created for myself societies of perfect creatures, celestial in their virtue and in their beauty, and of reliable, tender, and faithful friends, such as I never found here below. I took such pleasure in thus soaring into the empyrean in the midst of all the charms that surrounded me, that I spent countless hours and days at it, losing all memory of anything else. No sooner had I eaten a hasty morsel than I was impatient to escape and run into my woods once more, or maybe onto the screen of my cell phone if he had been living in this century, and watching endless hours of TikTok or reruns of Friends. That witless comedy by which future generations will condemn us. No sooner had I eaten a hasty morsel than I was impatient to escape and run into my woods once more. When I was about to set out foot for my enchanted world and saw wretched mortals appearing to me to hold down to earth, I could neither restrain nor conceal my annoyance. Indeed, I lost control of myself and gave them so rude a reception that it might almost have been called brutal. This escape from human society, but the escape into the realm of imagination, of another world. Augustine recognized that that's what lust really is. Right? Lust isn't simply about satisfying a sexual desire. It's about constructing an alternative reality and figuring out the point of entry into that alternative reality, wherein all the cares and problems and concerns of this reality will be left behind. If I can just, if you've ever read Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence, there's a great scene in there where Leland Archer is trying to do this with the Countess Olenska. And he says, if we can just be together, all this world will be left behind. All right? And I don't have to worry about what other people think. And I don't have to worry about the pressures of my profession. And I don't have to worry about all these social niceties and manners and so forth. And she says to him two things. There is no such world. And even if there were, we could never find happiness in that world behind the backs of the people that we love. She's the mature, responsible one. The other thing is to make social life conform to nature, and that is our natural compassion for other human beings. There are various passages in the Confessions where Rousseau talks about his fundamental sense of injustice that arises when he sees people being oppressed. Loves the oppressed, hates the oppressor. And so, is there a way we can create a social world without either oppressed or oppressors? And of course, that means taking the world and turning it upside down as we know it. So the two paths that we are led to are either escape or revolution. Rousseau is, just to wrap up, I think the architect of the world that we live in. This emphasis on feeling over reason, this emphasis on authenticity. Right? That as long as I am true to myself, as I understand myself to be, moreover, as I feel myself to be, that I am living the right kind of life. And other people are required to recognize that authenticity in myself. And if they don't recognize me as I understand myself to be, they're engaged in acts of oppression. Right? Because this is the true self. The true self is the self as I understand myself to be. So much of our moral language, so much of our thinking about who we are, so much of our thinking about politics in the world we live in comes from Rousseau. I think he is the great architect of our contemporary world, a man well ahead of his time. We'll end it there, and then we'll have an open conversation.